I woke up when the sky had already grown dim. My mouth tasted bitter, my head felt heavy like a stone was pressing down on it, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. No sound of a car, no voice from my son, no laughter from my daughter-in-law like at noon. Just the forest, and the cold slowly crawling into my spine. I called out Michael's name. No one answered. When I tried to sit up, my hands trembled, a feeling so familiar it was frightening. Exactly like the time the doctor gave me a sedative after my wife's funeral 3 years ago. And in that moment, a thought rose up and took my breath away. They hadn't forgotten me. They had left me here, on purpose. If they thought I would die in this forest, they were wrong. Because right then, a decision ignited in my mind. I would live, and if I made it back, someone would pay a heavy price for what they had done today. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. I lay still for a few more seconds, not because I was calm, but because my body wasn't obeying my commands. Everything in my head moved slowly and heavily, as if someone had poured concrete into my skull. When I blinked, the treetops above swayed, and the sunset broke into torn patches of orange and gold through the leaves. I smelled damp earth, pine sap, the cold scent of the mountains as the day was ending. There was no smell of gasoline, no smell of food, no sign of human presence except myself. I realized I was lying beneath a large pine tree, its rough trunk pressing into my back. My old backpack was wedged under my head like a makeshift pillow. I had used it as a pillow before my afternoon nap, a habit from decades ago, from camping trips when I was young and could sleep anywhere without a mattress. I reached back, pulled the backpack up, and checked it by reflex. It was still there. But what wasn't there was the car. Michael's gray SUV, gone. No fresh tire tracks, no engine idling while waiting for me to wake up. Just a terrifying emptiness, as if the forest had swallowed every trace of the afternoon just hours earlier. I tried to take a deep breath, but my throat was dry and burning. The metallic taste in my mouth made me grimace. That wasn't the taste of fruit juice. It wasn't the taste of the ham sandwich Laura had prepared. It was the taste I hated most in the world, the taste of medication. My heart started pounding harder. I licked my lips and tried to swallow, but there was almost nothing to swallow. This feeling, I knew it all too well. 3 years earlier, after Elizabeth died, there were nights I couldn't sleep. I would sit for hours in the living room, staring at the armchair where she used to read, listening to the ticking clock hammering into my head. The family doctor prescribed a mild sedative. "Only take it when you really need it, Henry," he said. And every morning after, when I woke up, I felt exactly like this. Heavy head, shaking hands, bitter mouth, my mind foggy as if wrapped in cotton. But that dose was never this strong. I pressed my hands into the ground and tried to sit up. The world spun, my body tipping to one side. I had to grab onto the tree trunk to keep from falling. My chest heaved, my breathing shallow and rapid. I called out again, louder this time, my voice cracking in the cold air. "Michael!" There was no answer. "Laura!" Only the wind moving through the branches, carrying a dry, rustling sound. Somewhere in the distance, a bird flapped its wings, then went silent. This silence wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was like an empty room after everything has been cleared out, even the memories. I looked around, trying to piece together what had happened before I sank into that heavy sleep. This morning, Michael showed up at my house earlier than usual. He smiled more than normal. A wide, slightly tense smile, like he had practiced it in the mirror. "Dad, the weather's great today," he said. "I think we should get out a bit. Go on a picnic. Just family." Family. That word had softened me. How long had it been since Michael last invited me anywhere on his own? Almost a year. 2. After Elizabeth passed, everything between us slowly became distant. He still called, but the calls grew shorter. He still stopped by, but only stood in the doorway, asked a few polite questions, then made an excuse about being busy. Laura was always polite, but it was the politeness of someone who didn't want closeness. And yet, this morning, they sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee, talking about the weather, about a scenic mountain trail I had taken Michael on when he was a boy. I thought maybe this was a good sign. Maybe my son had finally remembered that I was still here. The trip itself was normal, even pleasant. We drove up into the western mountains where rows of pine trees stretched endlessly, and the air was so clean it made your lungs ache. Laura spread out the picnic blanket on the grass. She handed me a glass of juice, said it was the kind I liked. I don't remember how much I drank, only that it tasted a little more bitter than usual. I thought it was just a different fruit. After the meal, Michael put a hand on my shoulder. That touch warmed my heart for a brief moment. "Dad, lie down and rest for a bit," he said. "The air up here is really nice." And I did, like a fool. Now, sitting alone beneath this tree, I could see the pieces fitting together into a shape I didn't want to look at. The overly bright smile, the sudden kindness, the juice, the suggestion to rest, everything led to this moment, the moment I was left behind. Panic surged in my chest, like a trapped animal suddenly thrashing. I looked up at the sky. The light was fading fast. Orange turned to deep purple, then gray. The temperature dropped noticeably, slipping through the thin jacket I was wearing. I hadn't brought anything warmer. I hadn't brought my phone. I remembered leaving it in the car because Michael said there was no signal here. "No need to bring it, Dad," he had said. I let out a dry, bitter laugh in my throat. My body was still weak, but my mind was clearer now, clear enough to understand that if I panicked, I would die faster. I took a deep breath, then another, forcing my heart to slow down. I couldn't run around aimlessly. Not now, just if, there was even a tiny part of me that still wanted to believe this was a mistake, that Michael would turn the car around when he realized I wasn't there, then I had to stay right here. Leaving now would mean cutting off that fragile chance with my own hands. I pulled the backpack closer and hugged it to my chest like a shield. Inside were only a few small things: a spare shirt, a thin sweater, a nearly empty water bottle, and a few odds and ends I carried out of habit. Not much, but it was everything I had right now. The wind grew stronger. I shivered, and in the cold spreading through me, something else was spreading too. A feeling I never thought I would have to face at this age. The feeling of being betrayed by my own son. I leaned my back against the tree, my eyes fixed on the spot where the car had been parked. I would wait. Not because I was weak, but because I needed to know the truth all the way through. And if that truth was what I was starting to realize, then tonight was only the beginning of a journey I had never imagined. I would not die here. Not like this. Not in silence. I sat there, my back against the cold tree trunk, both arms wrapped tightly around my old backpack. And in that suffocating stillness, my life began to come into focus more clearly than ever before. Maybe when people face the possibility of never returning, their memories automatically burst open, like a book that has been locked for too long and is suddenly forced open from the beginning. My name is Henry Caldwell. 79 years old. My entire life I never thought I would end up in a place like this. An old man sitting alone in the mountains, waiting for his son to come back or for death to arrive first, whichever came sooner. I had a life that, from the outside, gave me little to complain about. More than 40 years as a construction engineer for an infrastructure company in Colorado, I worked my way up from the lowest position, learning how to calculate every steel beam, every foundation, every number on a blueprint. I was never wealthy, but I was never lacking. I bought this suburban house with my own salary, raised 2 children properly, and retired with the feeling that I had done my duty. The best thing in my life wasn't my career. It was Elizabeth. I met her when we were young at a small gathering of friends. She wasn't the kind of woman who made an entire room turn their heads, but after just a few minutes of talking to her, people remembered her forever. Elizabeth had a warm, steady voice and eyes that always carried a strange calm, as if she knew everything would be okay. Throughout 46 years of marriage, she was the one who kept me from drifting too far away from myself. When I lost my temper, she reminded me to lower my voice. When I became too rational, she reminded me to listen to my feelings. When I was exhausted from work, she brewed coffee, sat across from me, and asked one simple question. "Are you okay today?" 3 years ago, Elizabeth passed away after a stroke. So fast I had no time to prepare. That morning she was still standing in the kitchen, saying she would cook the stew I liked that evening. By afternoon I was standing in a hospital room, holding her hand, listening to the steady hum of machines, and then there was nothing. The house doubled in size in a single day. After the funeral, many people came. Michael and Laura stayed a few days. Rebecca flew in from another state and cried more than I did. But then, like everything in life, that attention faded. People had to return to their jobs, to their lives, and I stayed behind, alone in a house where every corner carried Elizabeth's presence. In the mornings, I brewed coffee for 2, then remembered only I would drink it. In the evenings, I turned on the TV just for the noise, not because I was really watching. The books on the shelves, the chairs, the dining table, all of it was still there, but the person who gave it meaning was gone. Michael and Laura began visiting less often. At first, they tried to keep up appearances. "Dad, we're just so busy," Michael would say on the phone. "Work, kids, everything." I understood. I never blamed him for that. But slowly, the tone changed. "Dad, this house is really big. Don't you feel lonely living here by yourself?" Laura once said, looking around the living room as if she were measuring something. "Dad, the stairs are pretty steep. What if you fall?" Michael added, his voice sounding concerned but his eyes flicking quickly over the door frames and walls. I laughed it off. I said I was fine. I still drove myself, cooked for myself, took care of the backyard, but every time I felt like I had to justify my own existence. What sounded like harmless comments began to leave small cuts. "At your age, you really shouldn't live alone. Have you thought about the future? Do you have a will?" Those questions didn't come all at once. They came scattered, gently, enough that if I reacted strongly, I would seem paranoid. But I wasn't stupid. I just didn't want to believe it. Rebecca was different. She called me every week, even though she lived thousands of miles away. She asked how I was eating, whether I was keeping up with my checkups. When she visited, she didn't look at the house like an asset. She looked at me, really looked at me. But Rebecca had her own family, her own job. I never wanted to be her burden. The first signs of greed didn't come like a hard blow, but like drops of water falling steadily on the same spot. Michael once joked during a meal, "If Dad moved into a smaller place, it'd be easier to clean and more convenient for us to visit." Laura laughed along. I laughed too, even though something inside me felt uneasy. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that I had lost my wife, so I was prone to imagining things, that my son could never think that badly. And then this picnic happened. Michael called me 2 days earlier, his voice unusually upbeat. "Dad, we think you should get out a bit. Staying in the house all the time isn't good for you. Let's go on a picnic, clear your head." I hesitated. I wasn't as strong as before. But the way Michael spoke, the way he smiled when he picked me up that morning, softened me. Laura brought food, carefully prepared. They talked more than usual, asked me about my younger days, about old trips. In that moment, I allowed myself to believe this was a gesture of reconciliation. That maybe I had misunderstood them. That maybe, after everything, family was still family. I believed, because I am a father. Now, sitting in the mountains as darkness crept in, I understood that it was that very trust that had brought me here. And the most painful realization wasn't the cold or the dizziness in my head. It was understanding that the thing that had once been my entire world, my family, could turn their backs on me so easily. I sat there, my back against the pine tree, both hands wrapped around the backpack as if it were the only thing still tying me to this world. I didn't dare go anywhere. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I was afraid of going the wrong way. Afraid that if I stood up, if I stepped away from this spot and the car came back, I wouldn't be here to see it. The wind moved through the forest, sending waves of cold through my collar. I zipped my jacket higher and bowed my head, trying to stay warm. The ground beneath me had grown cold, the mountain cold that settles in when the sun disappears. I looked toward the dirt clearing where Michael had parked at noon. From here, I could still faintly see it. I told myself, just 10 more minutes. Maybe they're turning the car around. Maybe they realized I wasn't in the back seat. Maybe... A small sound behind me made me jump. My heart slammed into my throat. I spun around, almost leaping to my feet, but it was only a dry branch snapping under the weight of some animal. A deer, perhaps. It stood still for a second, looking at me with dark, silent eyes, then vanished into the trees. I let out a breath, my shoulders sagging. Hope flared and died so fast it hurt. Though time crawled so slowly, I felt like each minute was scraping against my skin. I had no watch, only the fading light to measure it by. The last orange glow at the treetops dulled, turned deep purple, then ash gray. Darkness didn't fall all at once. It crept in, little by little, like something alive and deliberate. Every sound became a promise and then a betrayal. Wind through dry leaves sounded like footsteps. Branches rubbing together sounded like a car door closing. At one point, I could swear I heard the familiar metallic jingle of keys. I called out until my voice went hoarse. "Michael!" My voice dissolved into the forest with no echo. I called Laura's name, then Michael's again. Each time I waited, holding my breath, like a child standing behind a door, hoping to hear an adult answer. But there was nothing. The forest didn't respond. It just stood there, dense and indifferent. When darkness fully settled, I knew I had crossed a line. It was no longer just wait a little longer. This was night. My first night here. And with it, a thought I had been avoiding all afternoon became brutally clear. They were not coming back. I don't know exactly when that realization hit. There was no thunderclap, no dramatic collapse, just an emptiness spreading through my chest, like when you finally hear bad news you've been expecting all along. Hope didn't vanish instantly. It retreated, step by step, leaving behind something much heavier, the feeling of being abandoned. I had always been afraid of death. Who isn't? But sitting there in the dark forest, I realized that fear of death hurt less than knowing that the people I trusted most had decided I could disappear, that my existence was no longer important enough for them to turn around, that I had become something that could be forgotten, or worse, removed. My hands began to shake harder, not just from the cold. The medication still hadn't worn off. Every movement was slow and clumsy. I pulled the backpack closer, unzipped it, and rummaged through it in the dim light. I found the thin sweater and put it on. It wasn't warm enough, but it was better than nothing. I took one small sip from the water bottle, just one, because I didn't know how long I would need it. I closed my eyes and rested my head against the tree trunk. In the darkness, Elizabeth's face appeared with startling clarity. Not the image of her lying motionless in a hospital bed, but Elizabeth as she had been in ordinary days, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, standing in the kitchen, hair neatly tied back, turning to look at me with a gentle smile. "Liz," I whispered, my voice breaking, "if you're still somewhere, help me." I'm not someone who prays often, but right then there was no one else left for me to talk to. I told her where I was, that Michael had brought me up here, that I didn't understand what had happened. I spoke as if she were sitting beside me, listening, the way she always used to. The cold seeped in deeper. It wasn't just on my skin anymore. It felt like it was sinking into my bones. I curled up, pulling my knees tight to my chest. Every time the wind picked up, I shivered, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. My head was still heavy, my thoughts slow and scattered. At times, I almost drifted off, only to jolt awake at some sudden sound. I didn't dare sleep, not really because I was afraid of wild animals, but because I was afraid I wouldn't wake up again. In those rare moments of clarity, I thought about Michael when he was little. I remembered the first time I took him camping. He was afraid of the dark, clutched my hand tightly, kept asking if there were dangerous animals. I laughed and told him that as long as Dad was there was nothing to be afraid of. And now here I was, sitting in that same darkness, and the boy who had grown into a man had decided to leave me alone. That thought sent a sharp pain through my chest. Not a physical pain. It felt like a crack spreading quietly, steadily, something irreversible. The night was longer than I expected. With no sense of time, everything became blurred. I heard an owl calling somewhere far away, the dry rustle of leaves as something moved through the forest. Every sound made my body tense, bracing for the worst, even though I knew I had nothing to defend myself with except a piece of wood I'd grabbed in a hurry. At some point, I stopped begging for them to come back. I only begged to survive the night. I promised Elizabeth and myself that if morning came, I would find a way. Somehow, I wouldn't allow myself to end here on this first night. And then, very slowly, the sky began to change. There wasn't bright light right away, just a pale gray slipping in between the treetops, enough to tell darkness from shape. I opened my eyes wider, staring upward, afraid that if I looked away, dawn would disappear. As that faint light gradually grew clearer, I felt something else rising inside me. Not relief, not gratitude, anger. It didn't explode violently. It was cold, dense, and heavy. It completely replaced the hope that had died during the night. When the sun began to rise, sending its first rays through the forest, I understood that I had survived my first night. But at the same time, I understood something else, more clearly than ever. From this moment on, I was no longer waiting for them. If I got out of here, if I had enough strength to return, I would not stay silent. And that thought, in that cold dawn, was the only thing that made me feel like I was still alive. The morning light filtering through the canopy didn't bring the warmth I had hoped for. It was only enough to let me see more clearly where I was, and the clearer I saw, the worse things looked. After a night of almost no sleep, my body was stiff, every joint making a soft protest when I tried to stand. I leaned against the tree, took a few deep breaths, then stepped away from the spot where I'd sat all night. The first thing I did was head toward the clearing where the car had been parked yesterday. I remembered that spot clearly. I remembered the slight dip in the ground, the smell of trampled grass, even the way the midday sun had slanted across the windshield. I bent down, eyes close to the ground, searching for the simplest thing: tire tracks. There were none. Not blurred by wind or naturally covered by fallen leaves. There wasn't a single mark, not even the faintest line. The ground looked strangely smooth, as if someone had deliberately stepped over it, erasing every trace. I walked around, checking other places where the car might have turned around. The result was the same. Smooth. Clean. Too clean for a spot where an SUV had been parked not long ago. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the weather. I crouched down, scraping at the top layer of dirt with my hands, hoping to find a displaced pebble, an unusually broken branch. But even those small details were gone. I lifted my head and looked around, and for the first time that morning, I felt afraid in a different way. Not the vague fear of the night, but the fear that comes when you begin to understand the true nature of what you're facing. I turned toward the trails leading out of the clearing. Yesterday, when I was still clear-headed, I remembered seeing at least 2 distinct paths. One went downhill, another followed the side of the mountain. Now both were muted, not completely gone, but deliberately made to look the same. Dry leaves spread evenly, broken branches pushed aside, the ground pressed flat so no direction stood out. I stood still, slowly turning, fixing the position of each tree, each rock in my mind. The more I looked, the more terrifying the realization became. For someone unfamiliar with this area, for an old man who had just woken up from a sedative, every path here looked identical. There was no sign clear enough to tell which way was the main trail and which led nowhere. This wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate. That thought forced me to sit down again. I remembered Michael's face as he drove. He'd worked in real estate for years. He was used to reading land, used to calculating access and routes. Laura was meticulous to the point of obsession. Everything they did was planned. And now, standing in this scene, I couldn't lie to myself anymore and pretend this was all an accident. I went back to where I'd slept the night before and checked my backpack again, as if hoping my phone would somehow appear inside. But no. My phone was still in the car. I remembered clearly placing it in the console because Michael said there was no signal here, so bringing it was pointless. At the time, I hadn't thought twice. Now I understood. No phone, no map, no way to call for help. I was completely cut off from the outside world. A feeling of total isolation closed in on me. Not the kind of loneliness you feel in an empty house where there are still neighbors, still the sound of cars on the street. This was primal isolation, where everything around me was indifferent to whether I existed or not. If I collapsed here, this forest wouldn't remember me. It would turn green again in spring, shed its leaves in fall, as if I had never set foot here. I stood up, trying to stay calm, but my breathing had already quickened. I took a few steps down the trail on the left. After only a dozen steps, the scenery began to look different. Then I turned back and tried the trail on the right. Just a short distance and everything changed again. The trees grew denser, the light shifted, the ground tilted slightly in another direction. I turned in a circle trying to find my starting point, and for a few terrifying seconds, I panicked when I realized I wasn't sure where I was compared to before. My heart pounded. The dizziness returned, not just from the medication still lingering in my system, but from the fear closing in around me. Every path seemed reasonable. Every direction could be the way out, or deeper into the forest. I clenched my teeth and forced myself to stand still. Panic now would only make me make mistakes faster. I looked up at the sky, trying to figure out the sun's position. The morning light slanted in, but the canopy blocked much of it, making orientation harder than I expected. I had never been good at survival. My past camping trips always had plans, maps, people with me. I had never had to rely entirely on instinct at nearly 80 years old. And then another thought formed in my mind, heavier than all the rest. I hadn't just been left behind. I'd been left behind in a way that made it hard for me to find my way out. If I wandered aimlessly, I would exhaust myself. If I stayed still too long, I would die of cold, hunger, or something worse. I rested my forehead against the tree trunk and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself. When I opened them again, I forced myself to face the rawest truth, the one I'd been avoiding since last night. They didn't just want to leave, they wanted to make sure I wouldn't come back. That realization made my stomach tighten, not because it surprised me, but because of its brutal clarity. Every detail suddenly made terrifying sense. The sedative to knock me out, leaving while it was still light, erasing the tire tracks, blurring the trails, leaving my phone behind. All of it came together into a complete picture, cold, calculated, with no room for chance. I stood there for a long time, weighing my options. Staying put felt safer, but it was also a way of waiting to die. Hoping that someone would randomly pass through a remote forest like this was gambling my life on luck. I didn't have time to hesitate. Every minute that passed, my body grew weaker, my energy drained away. In the end, I chose a path. Not because I believed it was the right way out, but because I understood that choosing nothing at all was the worst choice. I marked the nearest tree with a small scratch, using a sharp stone to lightly score the bark. It was the only sign I could leave, so at least I'd know where I had come from. I tightened the straps of my backpack, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. With every step away from that clearing, I felt myself leaving behind the last shred of hope that this was all just a misunderstanding. As the trees behind me faded from view, an irreversible truth weighed down on me. For the first time in my life, I didn't just think it. I truly understood, with my body and my mind. The people I had once been willing to sacrifice everything to protect had decided that I should disappear from their lives. And understanding that, no matter how painful, made me alert in a completely different way. I was no longer a father waiting for his son to return. I was a man trying to survive in a world where his own family had chosen to turn their backs. I walked slowly, very slowly, not because I wanted to conserve energy, but because my body wouldn't allow anything faster. Each step felt like a negotiation with every joint, every muscle worn down after a cold night and a morning full of fear. I tried to keep my breathing steady, my ears straining for any sound, my eyes constantly scanning the trees and bushes as if a single moment of distraction would let the forest swallow me whole. I didn't know how long I'd been walking. Out here, time no longer meant what it used to. It wasn't measured by clocks or calendars, but by sensation in the body. And my body was saying one thing very clearly. I was hungry. The dry bread in my backpack was the first thing I thought of. I hesitated for a long time before taking it out. The bread was hard, the edges so dry they made a faint cracking sound when I broke it. I tore off a small piece and chewed slowly, trying to stretch out the feeling of having something in my mouth. Not because it tasted good, but because it was the only thing that made my stomach stop clenching for a moment. I didn't dare eat much. The water bottle was already more than half empty. Every sip had to be considered, like spending the last of your money. Hunger didn't come all at once. It arrived quietly, persistently, clinging to me like a shadow. At first, it was just emptiness, then a dull ache, like someone slowly twisting my insides. After that, it became an obsession. Everything I saw turned into food in my mind. A bush, a small dark berry, an unfamiliar leaf. I hated this feeling. It made me no longer myself. At one point, I stopped in front of a low bush with a few small, round, dark purple berries. They looked harmless. I stood there for a long time, arguing with myself. I had read somewhere that many wild berries look similar but can kill you within hours. But hunger doesn't care about knowledge. It only whispers that you need to eat right now. In the end, I picked one berry and held it to my nose. No smell. I hesitated a few more seconds, then put it in my mouth and bit down gently. A sour taste spread, not too unpleasant. I swallowed. Just minutes later, my stomach began to cramp violently. Sweat broke out on my forehead. I doubled over and vomited uncontrollably, tears streaming from my eyes. Everything I had just eaten, along with the bit of dry bread, was forced back up in painful spasms. I knelt there for a long time, gasping for air, my mouth more bitter than before. Weakness flooded my body. I had been stupid, but in that moment I also understood something. This forest wouldn't give me a second mistake. Every decision had a price, and I didn't have the strength left to pay much more. When the nausea passed, I sat leaning against a rock, my head bowed. The hunger was still there, but now it came with fear. I didn't dare try anything unfamiliar again. All I had left was dry bread and a little water, and both were running out. In those rare moments of rest, my thoughts drifted far away from the present to something completely different. I thought about my house, the suburban home with the white wooden fence, the backyard where Elizabeth used to grow lavender. I thought about the living room, the old armchair where I sat reading every afternoon. I thought about my small library, the dark wooden shelves, the familiar smell of old paper. I had spent my whole life building those things. Not just assets, but a life. And in those thoughts, other memories began to intrude. Memories I had deliberately ignored before. "Dad, the housing market is really good right now," Michael once said over dinner, his tone as casual as if he were talking about the weather. "You'd get a great price if you sold now." "This place is too big for one person," Laura added, her eyes roaming like she was estimating value. "Have you thought about moving somewhere smaller?" Back then, I took those comments as advice. Now, in hunger and exhaustion, they stood out with brutal clarity, lining up in my mind like undeniable evidence. I remembered the times Michael asked about the house paperwork, about my will, about who I had named as beneficiary. I remembered how he went quiet when I said I wasn't in a hurry to change anything. Piece by piece, everything fit together in a cold, merciless way. This wasn't an impulsive act, not a moment of anger. It was the result of a long calculation. The sedative, the picnic, choosing a remote forest, erasing traces, leaving the phone behind. Everything pointed toward a single goal, making me disappear so they could take over everything without obstacles. That thought hurt more than the hunger. It tore at me from the inside, tightening my chest. I had been willing to do anything for Michael. I had worked overtime so he could attend a good school. I had co-signed loans so he could buy his first house. I had believed that everything I owned would naturally become his one day. And now that very belief had become the motive to remove me. I stood up and kept walking, even though my legs were starting to shake. The physical pain grew clearer. Sore shoulders, aching back, a dry, burning throat. But none of it compared to the waves of betrayal rising inside me. Hunger weakened me, but the emotional pain sharpened my awareness in a frightening way. I no longer thought about them coming back. That idea was completely dead. Instead, my mind kept circling one question. How could they do this? Not a question seeking an answer, but one that would never have a satisfying answer. At one point, I laughed out loud, a dry, hollow sound in the middle of the forest. I laughed at the bitter irony of life. I had lived honestly, worked hard, believed in family, believed in the values I was taught growing up. And now, those very values made me the easiest to hurt. When the afternoon began to fade, I stopped beside a large tree, my back against the trunk, eyes lifted to the sky through the leaves. I ate another small piece of bread, forcing it down my dry throat. Each bite was no longer just food, but a decision. Eat now or save it for later. Survive today or hope for tomorrow. In that moment, I realized a painful but clear truth. The emotional pain had surpassed the physical. Hunger could make me collapse. Cold could make me tremble. But it was the betrayal by my own family that was slowly grinding me down, making every step heavier. Still, somewhere deep inside, a stubborn part of me refused to surrender. Maybe it was the part Elizabeth had loved, the part that wouldn't give up even when everything was gone. I wasn't walking just to find a way out anymore. I was walking because I refused to let my life story end the way they had planned. And with that thought, amid gnawing hunger and relentless pain, I kept moving, each step slow but deliberate, carrying with me a truth that was becoming painfully clear. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had chosen property over blood. And that truth, even as it killed a part of me, became the only thing keeping me upright. I don't know how far I walked after the last time I stopped to eat a piece of dry bread. I only know that the light began to change, no longer harsh like midday, but turning into a pale, weary yellow that matched how my body felt. Each step was no longer a choice, but inertia. I walked because if I stopped, I was afraid I wouldn't get up again. That was when, among the endlessly repeating trees, I saw a shape that didn't belong to the forest. At first, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. A line too straight, a right angle out of place among nature's chaotic curves. I froze, my heart pounding, as if someone had yanked me out of a nightmare. I squinted, stepped closer, one slow step at a time, afraid that if I rushed, the thing in front of me would vanish. It was a cabin. Not large, not new, but unmistakably built by human hands. A slanted roof, dark wooden walls, a slightly crooked door. That was all it took for my throat to tighten. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt hope. Maybe it was when I still believed Michael would come back, when I still believed this was just a cruel misunderstanding. But the moment I saw that cabin, a sudden surge of life rushed through my body, so strong I had to grab onto a tree to keep from collapsing. There were people here, or there had been people here. And if there were people, then there would be water, food, a way out. I started moving faster, even though my legs hurt and my back felt like it might break. Every step now carried a silent prayer. Please don't be a hallucination. Please don't be a hallucination. I was far too exhausted to survive another collapse. As I got closer, the hope inside me hadn't died yet. The wooden door was slightly ajar. No lock, no sign that the structure had completely collapsed. I reached out, my hand trembling from hunger and exhaustion, and touched the door. The wood was cold and rough. Real. Not a dream. I pushed the door open. A musty, heavy, rancid smell rushed straight into my nose. I coughed softly but stepped inside anyway. The light inside was weak, slipping through a few gaps in the roof. In that first moment, I still tried to see everything through hopeful eyes. Maybe it was just old. Maybe it only needed a little cleaning. Maybe... But then I saw more clearly. The floor had sunk in places. One corner of the roof had collapsed, exposing rotten wooden beams. There was no bed, no proper table, just a few broken planks, a chair tipped on its side, and clear signs of animals. Dried droppings in the corner. Tufts of fur scattered on the floor. A rat's nest tucked into a wall cavity. No canned food, no clean water. No sign that this place had been used in years. The hope inside me didn't vanish instantly. It wavered, staggered, like a candle in the wind. I rummaged through everything, despite the stench and the sickening feeling. I opened every rotting wooden compartment, bent down to peer into every dark corner, even as my back screamed in pain. At one point, I dropped to my knees, groping under layers of thick dust, as if enough effort might make a can of food magically appear. There was nothing. This cabin wasn't a shelter. It was a reminder, another trap laid by hope. I stood in the middle of the cabin, gasping, my hands braced on my knees. A hoarse laugh burst out of my throat, completely out of control, laughing at my own stupidity, laughing because I had dared to hope. My throat burned, my eyes stung, but I had no tears left to cry. When I stepped back outside, the light had softened. I dropped onto a rock in front of the cabin, my head hanging low. I needed to rest, even if only for a few minutes. My body had reached its limit, and it was in that moment of weakness that I heard it. Not the wind, not a small animal. Footsteps. Very light, but enough to make me lift my head instantly. My heart stopped for a second. I turned toward the sound, my eyes wide, every sense stretched tight to the point of pain. Between the trees, not far from me, there was a figure. A real person, not imagined. I could see the shape, the movement, the way the light brushed their shoulder. I sprang to my feet, nearly falling from dizziness, but managed to keep my balance. "Hey!" I called out, my voice hoarse, weaker than I expected. "Please, help me." I stepped toward them, my hand raised instinctively, as if to show I meant no harm. The person froze. In that brief moment, our eyes met, and I saw fear, not concern, not pity, real fear. The person stepped back once, then again. I opened my mouth to say more, but before I could get the words out, they turned and ran fast, vanishing into the forest within seconds. "Wait!" I shouted, and this time I used every bit of strength I had left. "I'm lost! I need help!" I started after them, or the closest thing to running my body could still manage. Every step was pain. Branches whipped my arms and face, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. That might have been my only chance. But I was old. I was hungry. I was exhausted. The distance between us didn't shrink. It grew. The person disappeared completely, as if they had never existed. I managed a few more steps before my legs gave out. I collapsed, gasping for air, my chest aching as if it were being crushed. I lay there for a long time, my face pressed into the ground, the smell of decaying leaves filling my nose. And then I realized something that made my heart go cold. My backpack was no longer on my shoulders. In the panic, in the chase after the stranger, I had dropped it. I jerked upright, spinning around, my eyes scanning everywhere. The forest looked the same as ever, cruelly identical. There was no sign of which direction I had come from. My backpack, my blanket, my water bottle, my last piece of bread. All gone. I called my own name like a madman and started searching, step after step, but every direction looked exactly the same. I don't know how long I searched. I only know that eventually I stopped because I had no strength left. I stood in the middle of the forest, my arms hanging uselessly at my sides, my mind completely empty. In that moment, I understood with brutal clarity. I was utterly alone. No family, no supplies, no outside hope. Just me and this forest. Everything I had clung to had fallen away, layer by layer, until nothing was left to shield me anymore. My will to survive was stretched so thin I could feel it about to snap. A part of me wanted to sit down, lean my back against a tree, and let it all end. It would be easier, quieter. No more hunger, no more pain, no more thinking about Michael, about Laura, about the betrayal. But then, in the middle of those dark thoughts, an image rose clearly in my mind. Elizabeth, the way she used to look at me whenever I wanted to give up on something small. That look never blamed, never begged, just quiet faith. I swallowed hard. My throat was so dry it hurt, but I forced myself to stand. Slowly, shaking. Not because I was certain I would survive, but because I wasn't ready to accept defeat like this. If this was the limit, then I would reach it standing, not on my knees. And with that thought, empty and desperate, I stepped back into the forest. No backpack, no false hope, only a thin but stubborn will clinging on amid total collapse. I don't know how long I walked after losing my backpack. By then, the forest was no longer a place. It was a state. It surrounded me, pressed in on me, making every direction look so identical that my mind grew tired from trying to tell them apart. Each step felt like walking in a dream, slow, heavy, and stripped of any belief that I was heading the right way. I stopped when I heard a very faint rustling sound. Not wind. I was sure of that. Wind in the forest has its own rhythm, its own breath, the familiar whisper of leaves. This sound was different. low, sliding close to the ground as if something was moving very near me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear every beat in my ears. I looked down. Less than 6 feet from my feet, coiled on a sun-warmed rock, was a snake. Its body was thick, patterned in dark markings that blended almost perfectly with the earth and dry leaves. Its head was slightly raised, tongue flicking in and out, slow, watchful. I didn't know much about snakes, but I was old enough to know when not to move. My body froze completely. Every ache, every hunger pang, every thirst vanished, replaced by something more primitive. Stay still if you want to live. We stared at each other for several endless seconds. I could feel the heat rising from the rock, smell the damp earth, smell my own fear. I didn't know if it was venomous, but in that moment, it hardly mattered. One bite would be enough to end everything. The snake moved first. It slid away slowly, its body gliding over the rock before disappearing beneath the dry leaves. I didn't dare breathe deeply until it was completely gone. When I was sure it had moved away, my knees nearly gave out. I had to grab the nearest tree to keep from falling. Death had just passed me at a terrifyingly close distance, and it left behind a cold clarity. I understood that I no longer had the right to make mistakes, no right to rush, no right to panic. But hunger waits for no one. When sunlight filtered through the canopy and caught a cluster of small, pale orange fruit high above, survival instinct pulled me in another direction. I looked up. A tree not too tall, its lower branches just within reach if I tried. I knew I had promised myself not to try unfamiliar things again, but that promise was weaker than the hunger burning inside me. I approached the trunk, placed my hand on the rough bark, tested its firmness. I climbed slowly, inch by inch, using both hands and feet, not daring to hurry. Every movement made my muscles protest violently. As I reached toward the branch with the fruit, my heart raced again, this time not from fear, but from hope. Then everything happened too fast. A sharp cracking sound snapped beneath my foot. The branch I had put my weight on couldn't hold anymore. I didn't have time to think, no time to react. My body fell freely in a moment that was brief, yet long enough for me to know there was nothing I could do to stop it. I hit the ground hard. The first sound I heard wasn't a break. It was the air being forced out of my lungs. Then the pain exploded, violent and sharp, centered in my right leg. I screamed, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. The pain spread fast, from my shin to my knee, then slammed straight into my head like a hammer. I tried to move, and immediately regretted it. My leg didn't respond. A wrongness, something out of place, made nausea surge up. I lay there, cold sweat pouring off me even though the air was still warm. My vision blurred. I clenched my teeth, trying not to let a groan escape, but my body no longer obeyed me. In that moment, the thought of giving up appeared with shocking clarity, not as a burst of emotion, but as a gentle suggestion. You tried, Arthur. That's enough. No one would blame you. I closed my eyes, breathing fast, tears spilling, not from pain, but from despair. I lay there a long time. I don't know how many minutes passed. Time lost its meaning again. Only the pain was real, sharp, and unforgiving. But then another thought pushed its way in, weak but stubborn. If I stayed here, I would die, not from the snake, not from hunger, but because I had chosen to stop. And I wasn't ready to make that choice. I started to crawl, not stand, not drag myself with my legs. I used my elbows, my hands, pulling my body forward inch by inch. My broken leg dragged behind me like something that no longer belonged to me. Every movement sent bolts of pain through me, making me dizzy. I bit my lip until it bled, the metallic taste flooding my mouth, mixing with the dryness in my throat. The thirst became maddening, no longer just discomfort. It was a need that dominated every thought. My mouth was so dry, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. Every swallow felt like sandpaper scraping my throat. I breathed through my mouth, but that only made it worse. I began thinking of water the way one thinks of a loved one. Cold water. Even a single sip. I crawled without direction, with no clear sense of where I was going. I only knew I couldn't stop. I don't know how far I crawled, or how many times I collapsed again. My hands were torn, fingernails packed with dirt, my arms trembling from exhaustion. At times I stopped, pressing my forehead to the ground, gasping for air, thinking this might be the end. And then I heard it. At first it was faint. A small, steady sound like a whisper. I thought I was hallucinating, but then it came again, a little clearer. A rhythm so familiar my heart began to race. Water, not wind, not leaves, water flowing. I held my breath and listened. The sound didn't disappear. It was there, persistent, brutally real. A final surge of energy flared inside me. I changed direction and crawled toward the sound, even though every movement felt like it was tearing my body apart. The sound grew louder, clearer, and then, through a gap in the brush, I saw light reflecting. A shimmering strip, moving. A stream, not large, not violent, but water. Real water. I almost laughed, but instead a broken gasp escaped my throat. I dragged myself to the edge, no longer caring about mud or pain. I plunged my face down and drank. The water was so cold my teeth knocked together. I choked and coughed, but I kept drinking like an animal that had been thirsty too long. The water flooded my mouth, slid down my throat, into my empty stomach, and I had never known anything so precious. When the thirst eased a little, my body suddenly felt lighter. Strangely light. I lay on my side by the stream, half my body in the water, half on the bank. My leg throbbed dully, but the pain seemed to pull back, as if it too were tired of tormenting me. My eyelids grew heavy. The steady sound of the water lulled me into a haze. I knew I shouldn't sleep. I knew that very clearly. But my body no longer asked my permission. Before my consciousness slipped away, I thought of Elizabeth. Her face appeared with startling clarity. Calm, gentle. I didn't know if I would wake up again, and for the first time in days, I wasn't afraid of the answer. I closed my eyes, let my body go slack, and allowed the darkness to come, carrying with it a quiet acceptance. If this was the final boundary, then I had reached it with everything I had left. I woke up to a very strange sensation. Not exactly pain, not exactly relief. It was the feeling you have when you don't know where you are, only that you're still alive. The first sound I heard was no longer running water, but voices. Low, deep, broken, carrying a rhythm I had never heard before. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids were as heavy as stone. The light that slipped in was just enough for me to make out figures standing around me. They didn't stand too close, but not far either. I could feel their gazes, assessing, cautious. I wanted to speak, to ask where I was, but my throat was so dry I could only manage a faint groan. Someone bent down. A rough but not unkind hand touched my shoulder, then quickly pulled away, as if afraid to linger. A voice spoke, low and slow, completely unfamiliar to me. I didn't understand a single word. That made my heart beat faster. I had fallen from one wilderness into something even stranger than solitude. When I managed to open my eyes a little more, I realized I was lying on something soft but coarse, carrying the smell of smoke and earth. The ceiling above wasn't the kind I recognized. It was woven from natural materials, light filtering through small gaps, creating dim streaks of brightness. I turned my head slowly, the pain in my leg immediately reminding me how bad my condition still was. The people around me didn't look like anyone I had ever met. Their skin was sun-darkened, their clothes simple, layered, made of rough fabric in muted colors. No phones, no watches, nothing that reminded me of the world I knew. In my half-conscious state, I realized I had been brought into a community living completely cut off from the rest of the world. Suspicion was written clearly on their faces. Not malice, but a kind of instinctive caution. I was a stranger, an old man, ragged, injured, emerging from deep in the forest. In their place, I would probably have looked at myself the same way. An older man stepped forward, older than the rest. He said something, his voice firm and decisive. The others nodded. I saw them exchange glances as if weighing something. I wanted to explain, to say that I wasn't a threat, that I was just a father who had been abandoned, but every word was stuck in my throat. A bowl was brought close to my mouth. Inside was water. I looked at it the way one looks at a miracle. The person holding the bowl gestured for me to drink. I tried to lift my head, but I didn't have the strength. In the end, they tilted the bowl, letting the water flow slowly into my mouth. I drank in small sips, feeling life return bit by bit. No one spoke during that time. Only their eyes stayed on me, watching, observing my reaction. After I finished drinking, they stepped back. No one smiled. No one acted overly friendly. Silence settled over the space, heavy but not hostile. I lay there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to organize my thoughts. I understood that even though they had saved me from death, I still wasn't truly safe. Not because they meant me harm, but because they didn't yet know who I was. The fabric door was pulled aside. A younger person stepped in. He was different from the others, not just because of his age, but because of his manner. He wore slightly more modern clothes, his eyes more alert, like someone who had seen the outside world. He looked at me for a few seconds, then spoke. "Sir, can you understand me?" English. Hesitant, but English. I couldn't hold back my tears. Just that single sentence was enough to make all the tension inside me collapse. I nodded, my lips trembling. "I can, thank God." He turned and said something to the others, his voice faster, clearer. I didn't understand the words, but I saw their attention shift entirely to him. Then he turned back to me, sat down a little closer, still keeping a respectful distance. "My name is Daniel," he said. "I studied outside for a few years. I'll translate for them. But you have to tell the truth. Where are you from? What were you doing in the forest?" I swallowed, my throat still burning. But this time, I could speak. I spoke slowly, one sentence at a time, as if afraid that if I spoke too fast, everything would disappear. "My name is Arthur," I began. I was left behind. Daniel frowned slightly. I saw him listening carefully, and I knew this was the deciding moment. I told him everything. No embellishment, no exaggeration. I told him about the picnic, about the unnatural drowsiness, about waking up alone in the forest. I told him about the days of hunger and thirst, about losing my backpack, about the snake, about the fall that broke my leg. I told him about crawling through the forest, about the sound of water that saved me from dying of thirst. As I spoke, Daniel kept translating for the others. I saw their faces change little by little. First suspicion, then surprise. And gradually something like compassion appeared. The older man who had first looked at me so sharply studied me for a long time, his eyes no longer as cold as before. When I spoke about my son leaving me behind for property, a soft murmur rippled through them. I didn't understand their words, but I understood the emotion. Anger needs no shared language. Daniel turned back to me. They believe you now," he said quietly. "They think you're not a bad man." A weight lifted from my chest. I let out a slow breath, feeling as if I had just passed through a narrow gate that, if I hadn't made it through, would have ended all my chances. After that, things moved more quickly. Two older women stepped forward. They carried warm water, clean cloth, and things that looked like herbs. Daniel explained that they were going to treat me. I nodded, even though anxiety still lingered inside me. But I had come too far to have a choice now. They carefully removed the makeshift wrapping around my leg. When my leg was exposed, I heard a small intake of breath. Not mine. Their expressions shifted slightly. The pain surged back without anything holding it steady, but I clenched my teeth and endured it. One of them held my leg firmly, the other washed the wound with warm water. The stinging was so sharp I had to squeeze my eyes shut, my hands gripping the mat beneath me. Daniel said something to them in a calming tone. I didn't understand the words, but I felt the care in every movement. They weren't rushing. They weren't rough. They worked as if they were repairing something precious, not tending to an unknown stranger. After cleaning the wound, they applied a thick, dark paste with a strong but not unpleasant smell. A warm, tingling sensation spread, making me groan softly. Daniel looked at me and nodded. "It will hurt a little, but it's good." Finally, they used clean cloth and small wooden splints to stabilize my leg. When they finished, I was drenched in sweat, but the pain had eased somewhat. I let out a breath, clearly feeling that I had been pulled back from the edge of death. They fed me. Not much, just enough. A thin, warm porridge that was easy to swallow. I ate slowly, spoon by spoon, as if afraid of breaking this fragile moment. Never in my life had such a simple meal felt so precious. When things had settled, Daniel sat beside me. "You'll stay here for a while," he said. "They need to make sure you recover, and they also need time." I nodded. Inside, I knew my life was now in the hands of people who were complete strangers. But strangely, I no longer felt afraid. Not because I trusted them completely, but because after everything I had been through, being doubted fairly felt easier than being betrayed by my own blood. I lay there, among a community that wasn't mine, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of daily life outside, feeling exhaustion slowly pull me towards sleep. Before closing my eyes, one thought came to me with absolute clarity. These strangers had given me a chance to keep living, while the people I called family had chosen to leave me to die. And that thought, painful as it was, also carried an awakening I had never known before. The days that followed passed at a very different rhythm, slow and quiet, as if time in this place didn't run but simply breathed. I was no longer abandoned in the forest, but I wasn't pampered either. They cared for me in a simple, steady way. No fuss, no endless questions, no overt pity. And that was precisely what made me feel, for the first time in a long while, that I was still a human being. Not a burden, not a problem to be solved. Each morning, when light slipped through the gaps in the wooden roof, I woke to the faint smell of smoke and food cooking somewhere outside. One of the older women would usually bring me a bowl of warm water first, gesturing for me to drink slowly. They never rushed me. No one looked at me with impatience or annoyance because I moved slowly or spoke weakly. They simply waited. My leg was checked every day. They removed the old bandage, gently washed it with warm water, then applied that same dark herbal mixture again. At first, each time made me grit my teeth in pain. But after just a few days, the pain was no longer as sharp. The swelling went down, the bruising faded. I realized my body was healing, slowly but surely. Daniel often came to talk with me in the afternoons, when work in the village had eased. He told me about this community, about how they lived off the forest, about the unwritten rules they followed. No one was allowed to abandon the weak. No one was allowed to take what belonged to someone else. And if a stranger appeared on the brink of death, they had the right to be cautious, but not the right to turn away. I listened at first out of politeness, but the more I listened, the more I felt a quiet emptiness inside me being filled. Not by grand gestures or promises, but by very small things. The way they placed a bowl of water within my reach, the way they avoided making noise when I slept, the way they looked at me as an equal, even though I had nothing to give them in return. I stayed there not just for a few days, but for many weeks. Time passed, and with it, my strength slowly returned. I began to sit up longer, then practice standing with the help of a rough wooden cane they had made for me. The first steps were painful and awkward, but no one pushed me. Someone stood nearby, ready to catch me if I lost my balance, but no one touched me unless I needed it. The first time I managed to take a few steps on my own, I heard a soft clap behind me. Not cheering, not spectacle, just quiet acknowledgement. I turned and saw the older man from before, the one who had looked at me with the most suspicion, give a very slight nod. In that moment, my throat tightened. I ate with them, sitting around the fire in the evenings. The food was simple but enough. I didn't understand every story they told, but I understood the laughter. I understood the comfortable silences. I understood what it felt like to sit among people without having to prove that I was still useful. One evening, when the wind was stronger than usual, I stared into the fire and suddenly realized something that surprised even me. I was no longer tense, no longer afraid of being abandoned again, no longer watching every glance with suspicion. It was a feeling I hadn't had since Elizabeth was alive. I thought about that often during the long nights, about the way my son looked at me like a problem to be solved, about the way my daughter-in-law spoke to me like an obligation. And then I compared that to the way these strangers treated me, never asking how much money I had, never asking what I would leave behind for them, only asking if I was in pain, if I had enough water. Gradually, a very clear understanding formed inside me, not as some lofty philosophy, but as a simple truth. Family is not always decided by blood. There are people who share your blood but not your heart. And there are people who are complete strangers, yet willing to keep you alive when you have nothing left to give. When I was able to walk slowly around the village, Daniel asked me a question I knew was coming. "What are you going to do next?" The question hung between us for a long moment. I looked toward the forest, where the trees still stood silent, just as they had the day I was found. Then I looked down at my leg, still weak but strong enough to move forward. And finally, I looked at my hands, thinner than before, but still the hands that had built an entire life. "I have to go back," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "Not because I miss that place, but because I can't let things end the way they want them to." Daniel nodded and didn't ask anything more. He understood. Some things don't need long explanations. The days preparing for my departure passed quietly. They brought me dried food, enough for the journey. One woman handed me a small cloth bag filled with herbs for pain relief. The older man placed a hand on my shoulder, a brief touch, heavy with meaning. No one said long goodbyes. No one promised we would meet again. But in their eyes, I saw something stronger than words: respect. The morning I left, dew still clung to the ground. I stood at the edge of the village and turned back to look at them one last time. These people had given me more than life. They had given me a different way of seeing humanity, of understanding the bonds between people. I leaned on my cane and walked forward, step by step, slow but steady. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. I knew that. The city was waiting for me with questions, with stares, and likely with confrontations I wasn't ready to face. But I also knew something else, more clearly than ever before. I was no longer the man who had been left behind in the forest. I was a man saved by people who did not share my blood, but who shared something my own family had long since lost: humanity. The familiar road back to the suburbs appeared before me on a pale gray afternoon. The rows of trees along the street were still there, the low roofs behind wooden fences unchanged, but I was no longer the man who had left this place weeks earlier. Every step, even with a cane, sent a dull ache through my leg, a reminder of how close I had come to the edge of death. When my house came into view at the end of the street, my heart suddenly slowed, then dropped. Hanging in front of the gate was a white funeral wreath, a black ribbon tied tightly around it, the lettering clear, formal, cold. I stood frozen, staring at it for a long time, so long that a passerby glanced at me with curiosity. In that moment, everything became clear. No more evidence was needed, no more explanations. They hadn't just left me in the forest, they had declared me dead. A chill ran down my spine, not from the weather. I slowed my steps, my hand tightening around the cane. In front of the house, a few neighbors were standing together, speaking in low voices. When they saw me, their conversation stopped abruptly. One woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A man stepped back half a step as if he had just seen a ghost. "Arthur?" he said, his voice shaking. "That's not possible." I nodded very slightly. "It's me." No one spoke for several long seconds. I saw confusion, fear, then embarrassment spread across their faces. Someone whispered, We heard you had passed away. Michael said so. There were documents." I didn't answer. I didn't need to hear the rest. I just kept walking, passing through the familiar gate, through eyes that still hadn't caught up with what was happening. Each step felt like a drumbeat, slow but final. The front door of my house was slightly open. I stood there for a few seconds and took a deep breath. The smell of old wood, the smell of this house was still there. I pushed the door open. The first sound I heard was Michael's voice. Calm. Discussing. Not a trace of the voice of a man who had just lost his father. In the living room, where I used to sit and read every afternoon, Michael stood by the table. Laura sat across from him, holding a stack of papers. Beside them was a man in a suit, thin-framed glasses on his face, a leather briefcase neatly placed by his feet. A lawyer. On the table lay thick folders, property maps, bank documents, my house, my life, spread out like a project being divided. No one noticed me at first. I stood there, leaning lightly on my cane, looking at them as if at a scene from a stranger's life. The lawyer was talking about procedures, about remaining assets, about the finalization process. Laura nodded, taking notes. Michael stood with his arms crossed, looking tired but focused. Then Rebecca stepped out of the hallway. My daughter froze when she saw me. Her eyes went wide, her entire body stiffening, as if her mind couldn't process the image in front of her. The cup in her hand fell to the floor and shattered. "Dad?" Her voice broke, barely a sound. That sound cut through the room. Michael spun around. Laura did too. The lawyer looked up, his brows knitting together by instinct. In the moment Michael's eyes met mine, I saw everything on his face freeze. Not shock, not joy, fear. "Dad?" Michael said, but his voice didn't sound like a son seeing his father again. It sounded like someone who had just seen something that shouldn't exist. Laura jumped to her feet, her chair toppling backward. "No, that's not possible," she stammered, her eyes locked on me as if I were an apparition. Rebecca rushed to my side, her trembling hand touching my arm, as if to make sure I was real. "You're alive. You're really alive." Tears spilled freely. I placed my hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "I'm here," I said. "I'm not dead." The room fell into a heavy silence. The lawyer stood up and adjusted his glasses. "I'm sorry. What exactly is going on here?" he asked, his gaze shifting from me to Michael, then to Laura. "I was informed that Mr. Arthur had passed away in an accident." "I haven't passed away," I interrupted, my voice hoarse but clear. "And I think we need to talk." Michael swallowed. I saw his throat move. "Dad, we thought we couldn't find you." "In the forest," I said slowly. "After you left." Laura shook her head as if trying to deny it. "It was an accident. Dad got lost." "I was left behind," I replied. Not loudly, not trembling. Just one sentence, but it was enough to completely change the air in the room. Rebecca turned to look at her brother and sister-in-law, her expression shifting from shock to confusion. "What are you talking about? What do you mean Dad was left behind?" Michael opened his mouth, but no words came out. Laura glanced down at the stack of papers on the table, then looked at the lawyer, as if searching for a way out. The lawyer cleared his throat. "If Mr. Arthur is still alive," he said very carefully, "then everything we are doing here has no legal value." I nodded. "Exactly." I looked around the room. Every familiar detail suddenly felt foreign. The sofa set. The family photograph on the wall, where I was still standing next to Elizabeth, her smile frozen behind the glass. I looked back at Michael. "You told people I was dead," I said. "You hung a funeral wreath in front of my house." Michael lowered his head, his hands clenched tightly. "Dad, I thought you wouldn't come back?" I asked, my voice still even. "Or were you hoping I wouldn't come back?" Laura broke down crying, but it wasn't the sound of remorse. It sounded like the collapse of a plan falling apart. Rebecca looked at them, her eyes filling with anger. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice shaking but sharp. "What did you do to Dad?" No one answered right away, but that silence was clearer to me than any confession. I stood a little straighter despite the pain in my leg. I was no longer the man collapsed in the forest. I had come back from death, and my presence here in this room was already enough to begin exposing a truth they had tried to bury. I turned to the lawyer. "I think," I said, "you should hear my story before you sign anything else." His expression hardened. Rebecca tightened her grip on my hand. Michael and Laura stood there with nowhere left to retreat, and in that moment, I knew this was only the beginning. The truth had walked into this house with me, and it would not leave until everything was brought into the light. I sat down in my old armchair, the chair I had once thought I might never sit in again. The room was the same, but the atmosphere had completely changed. No longer a cold meeting about dividing assets, but a moment suspended between truth and consequence. The lawyer spoke first, very softly, very slowly. "Mr. Arthur," he said, "if you agree, I think we should hear you recount everything from the beginning." I nodded. Rebecca sat down beside me, her hand still gripping mine as if she feared that if she let go for even a second, I would disappear again. Michael and Laura stood opposite us. They didn't sit. They stood like students kept after class, not knowing where to look or what to say. I began to tell my story. I told them about that morning when Michael came to pick me up, his smile wider than usual, his cheerful tone almost forced. I told them about the picnic, about the unnatural exhaustion, about the bitter metallic taste in my mouth before I slipped into sleep. I told them about waking up in the forest, about the terrifying silence, about the cold creeping into my spine when I realized I was completely alone. The room was utterly still. I could hear the ticking of the second hand on the wall clock. I continued, leaving out nothing: the days of hunger and thirst, the piece of bread hard as a rock, the bottle of water slowly running dry, the vomiting after eating the wrong wild fruit, the fall from the tree, the pain when my leg broke, crawling through the forest meter by meter just to find water. I told them about the stream that saved me, about passing out, believing it might be the last moment of my life. Rebecca cried, silently. Tears simply fell onto her hand. The lawyer kept writing, his face growing tighter by the minute. I didn't look at Michael or Laura, but I could feel the weight coming from their side of the room. when I spoke about the community that saved me, the strangers who treated me, fed me, and cared for me for weeks without asking for anything. I paused for a moment. Not because I was tired, but because I needed to breathe. I looked up at Elizabeth's photograph on the wall. Her eyes in the picture were as gentle as ever. And then I came back, I went on. Came back to see a funeral wreath hanging in front of my house. Came back to learn that while I was fighting to stay alive, here, I had already been declared dead. Michael lowered his head deeply. Laura stood frozen, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The lawyer set his pen down on the table. "Mr. Michael," he said, no longer neutral, "do you deny any part of this account?" Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again. His shoulders trembled. I didn't think it would turn out like this," he said weakly. "I just thought Dad wouldn't come back. I thought everything would end quickly." "By letting me die in the forest," I said quietly. "That's how you thought everything would end." Laura burst into sobs. "We didn't directly harm you," she cried, clinging to a final argument. "We just left, that's all." The lawyer looked straight at her. Abandoning someone who cannot protect himself after giving him sedatives and erasing all traces, he said slowly, is not just leaving. Rebecca turned to them, her face pale. "You told me Dad was in an accident," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You told me he was dead. I believed you." No one could answer that. I took my phone from my jacket pocket, the phone I had bought again as soon as I returned to the city. My hand didn't shake. I dialed and called the police. I spoke briefly, clearly, that I was Arthur, that there was a matter requiring investigation, that I had been abandoned in the forest, declared dead, and that the people involved were currently in my home. Then I made another call. The press, not because I wanted a spectacle, but because I had learned one thing too well. What happens in the dark can only be stopped when it is brought into the light. I didn't dramatize. I simply said I was alive, and that there were serious questions that needed answers. When the police arrived, my house filled with dark blue uniforms and stern expressions. Michael and Laura were asked to sit separately, questioned piece by piece. The lawyer stood with me, providing the necessary documents, confirming that all asset division procedures underway were invalid. Rebecca never left my side. She sat close to me, like a quiet but unshakable wall. When Michael was led outside in handcuffs, I saw his face in that final moment. He was no longer the son I had raised, but a man facing the consequences of his own choices. Laura followed, her face streaked with tears, her eyes panicked. Neighbors gathered outside, cameras appeared, questions were shouted. I stood there in the middle of it all, and I didn't feel the satisfaction people imagine when the bad ones are punished. I felt empty, no joy, no sense of victory. Just a deep silence where I realized that no sentence could give me back the trust I had lost, or the years I once believed I had a whole family. When people finally drifted away, the house grew quiet again. Rebecca made me a cup of tea and placed it in my hands. She sat across from me, her eyes red but steady. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said softly. "I didn't know. If I had known—" I shook my head. "It's not your fault," I said. "You were the only one who was honest with yourself from the beginning." We sat there, father and daughter, in a house that had just weathered a storm. I no longer felt angry. I no longer wanted revenge. Everything I did wasn't to watch them fall, but to let the truth stand where it belonged. Justice, to me, isn't joy in someone else's suffering. It's calling things by their right names. It's actions having consequences. And it's me, after everything, still being able to sit here, breathe, drink tea, and know that I didn't stay silent in the face of what was wrong. Rebecca stayed with me that night, just the two of us, in a rare stillness. I looked out the window where the funeral wreath had already been taken down. Outside, the sky darkened. A long day came to an end, and for the first time since waking up in the forest, I felt that I had truly come home. The days that followed passed slowly. No more drama, no more noise, but heavy in a different way. My house returned to what it was meant to be, a place to live, not a battlefield, not a courtroom, not a place where people whispered and calculated behind each other's backs. Rebecca stayed with me for a while. She didn't say much, but every morning she made tea. Every evening she asked if my leg hurt. Her presence was quiet but solid, like an anchor holding me steady after everything that had happened. I didn't follow the investigation closely. I had said everything that needed to be said, brought into the light what needed to be seen. The rest belonged to the law, not to me. I found no comfort in reading the news or listening to gossip. Whenever someone said I was lucky, I just nodded. They didn't understand, and I didn't need them to. Survival doesn't always come with relief. Sometimes it comes with a very deep emptiness. There were nights when I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, my ears still hearing the wind in the forest. I would sit up, look around the familiar room, touch the table, the wall, reminding myself that I was home. In those moments, I thought a lot. Not about Michael or Laura, but about myself, about the signs I had ignored, about the times I chose silence because I thought keeping the peace mattered more than speaking the truth. I didn't blame myself, but I learned not to look away anymore. I began to reorganize my life in a different way, not defensively, but clearly. I updated my documents, changed my legal representation, wrote down my wishes transparently. I didn't do these things in anger. I did them with a calm that had cost me dearly to earn. Every decision was considered carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the living room window, I sat in my old armchair, my leg resting on a small footstool, a warm cup of tea in my hands. Rebecca sat across from me, reading a book. The scene was so simple that a few months earlier I would have taken it for granted. Now I understood that nothing is ever guaranteed. Everything can be lost very quickly if we don't recognize its value while we still have it. I thought often about the people who had saved me in the forest, people who shared no blood with me, no language, yet gave me what my own family could not, unconditional care. I sent back what I could, not to repay a debt, but to keep a quiet connection alive. They didn't need my gratitude, but I needed to remember that kindness still exists, even when it comes from the places we least expect. If there is one thing I learned from all of this, it is awareness. Not suspicion, but awareness in love. Trust doesn't mean closing your eyes. Love doesn't mean erasing all boundaries. Family, no matter how sacred, must never be a place where you lose your right to safety, to respect, to truly live. And before ending this story, I want to say one thing clearly. Not as a character in a story, but as a human being who has walked through the depths of betrayal and survived to tell it. The story in this video is a fictional story inspired by real-life situations and human experiences created to bring moral value, life lessons, and emotional impact to viewers. It does not encourage anyone to imitate the actions in the video, does not incite harm, and does not target any individual or organization. I believe the most important thing this story leaves behind is not punishment, but awareness. Awareness of personal boundaries, of listening to warning signs, of the right to say no even to family, and of the value of speaking up before it's too late. It also reminds us that true kindness needs no title, and that justice does not have to be driven by hatred. If you or someone you know has ever been exploited, controlled, or felt unsafe within your own family, please don't stay silent. Reach out to someone you trust, a legal professional, or local support hotlines. Document everything honestly and protect yourself first. Your safety and dignity are always more important than maintaining a false sense of peace. And if you've stayed with me all the way to these final lines, I want to say thank you. Thank you for listening, for your time, for allowing a story like this to exist in your thoughts. Where are you watching this story from? If you have thoughts or experiences you'd like to share, please leave a comment below. I read and value every single one. If this story touched you in any way, please like, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for the next stories. Your presence here is not taken for granted, and I am truly grateful for it.